Welcome back to Cheating Tales Lab. Thank you for tuning in. We've got another gripping story for you today, and we hope it keeps you entertained. Let's not wait any longer. Let's dive into the story. Brian Hendricks pulled into his driveway, the tires of his BMW crunching on the gravel. He just finished a grueling 36-hour shift at the trauma center. His eyes felt like sandpaper, and his muscles ached, but a small smile played on his lips. Home. Sophia. Maybe they could order in, watch a movie, just be together. He grabbed his bag from the passenger seat and headed for the front door. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn. Brian paused, frowning slightly. Sophia's car was in the driveway, but the house seemed quiet. Usually, she'd be in the kitchen by now, music playing as she prepared dinner. Shrugging off the unease, Brian entered, his key turning silently in the well-oiled lock. He set his bag down and was about to call out when he heard it, Sophia's laughter, coming from the study. But there were other voices too, tinny and distant. A video call. Brian's feet carried him towards the study door, left slightly ajar. He raised his hand to knock, announce his presence, when Sophia's words froze him in place. "You guys won't believe how easy it was," Sophia was saying, her tone dripping with smug satisfaction. "Brian's just my legal ticket out of here. Once I get my green card, Marco and I can finally be together in the States." Brian's world tilted on its axis. The hallway seemed to stretch and warp around him. He gripped the door frame, his knuckles turning white. Inside the study, Sophia continued, unaware of her audience. "It's almost too perfect. He works these insane hours at the hospital, so I have all the freedom I need. And he's so earnest, so trusting. He never questions anything." A chorus of giggles erupted from the computer speakers. "Girl, you've got it made," one of Sophia's friends chimed in. "How long until you can ditch him?" "Just a few more months," Sophia replied. "I've already started moving money into my private account. By the time I'm done, I'll be set up nicely, and poor, stupid Brian will be left with nothing but his precious career." Brian's shock gave way to a cold, creeping anger. 3 years. 3 years of what he thought was a loving marriage, reduced to nothing but a con. Every kiss, every touch, every whispered "I love you," all lies. He backed away from the door, his mind racing. He needed to think, to plan. This wasn't just about him anymore. How many other people had Sophia and this Marco scammed? How many lives had they ruined? Brian retreated to his home office, careful not to make a sound. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Leroy," he said when his friend picked up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need your help. Sophia's been lying to me this whole time. She's using me for a green card." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Damn, Brian. I'm so sorry. What happened?" Brian recounted what he'd overheard, each word tasting bitter on his tongue. When he finished, there was a long silence. "What are you going to do?" Leroy finally asked. Brian's free hand clenched into a fist. The initial shock was fading, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. "I'm going to make her pay," he replied, his tone hardening. "But I need to be smart about this. Can you come over? I need a witness and someone to keep me from doing anything stupid." "I'll be there in 20, Leroy said without hesitation. "Hang tight, man. We'll figure this out." Brian ended the call and sat back in his chair, staring unseeing at the wall. How had he been so blind? All the late nights Sophia claimed to be working, the sudden interest in his finances, the way she'd steered their conversations away from her past. It all made sickening sense now. He thought about confronting her, storming into the study and demanding answers. But no, Sophia had played him for a fool once. She wouldn't get the chance again. Brian took a deep breath, forcing his racing thoughts to slow. He was a trauma surgeon. He dealt with life-and-death situations every day, making split-second decisions that could save or end lives. He could handle this. He would handle this. By the time Leroy arrived, Brian had regained his composure. He led his friend to the kitchen, far enough from the study that Sophia wouldn't overhear them. "I called Maria," Leroy said as they sat at the kitchen island. "She's on her way. If anyone can help navigate the legal side of this mess, it's her." Brian nodded gratefully. Maria was a paralegal who specialized in immigration law. Her expertise would be invaluable. Tell me everything again, Leroy said, leaning forward. Start from the beginning. As Brian recounted the story once more, he felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were describing something that had happened to someone else. Leroy listened intently, his expression growing darker with each revelation. I can't believe she'd do this to you, Leroy said when Brian finished. After everything you've been through together. Brian's laugh was hollow. Apparently, we haven't been through anything together. It was all an act. Before Leroy could respond, there was a soft knock at the back door. Maria slipped inside, her face etched with concern. Brian, she said, giving him a quick hug. I'm so sorry about all this. Leroy filled me in on the basics. What do you need from me? The three of them gathered around the kitchen island, speaking in hushed tones. Maria's legal knowledge proved invaluable as they began to form a plan. You need to gather evidence, Maria advised. Record any conversations, save text messages, emails. Anything that proves she entered into this marriage fraudulently. Brian nodded, his jaw set. I want to do more than just divorce her. I want her gone. Leroy placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. We'll help you, man. But we need to do this right. No room for error. As they talked, Brian's phone buzzed with a text from the hospital. A massive pileup on the highway required all hands on deck. Despite his personal crisis, Brian's sense of duty kicked in. I have to go, he said, standing up. But this isn't over. Sophia has no idea what's coming. Leroy and Maria exchanged worried glances. Are you sure you're okay to work? Leroy asked. Given everything that's happened, Brian's expression hardened. I'm a professional. I won't let my personal problems interfere with saving lives. He paused, then added, besides, it'll give me a chance to think, to plan our next move. As Brian gathered his things to leave, he heard Sophia's laughter floating down from the study once more. The sound, once so dear to him, now set his teeth on edge. He turned to his friends. While I'm gone, can you two start looking into Sophia's background? See if you can find any connections to this Marco guy. I want to know everything. Maria nodded. I'll do some digging through immigration records. If they've tried this scam before, there might be a paper trail. And I'll reach out to some of my contacts in law enforcement, Leroy added. See if there are any open cases that match this MO. Brian felt a surge of gratitude for his friends. He wasn't alone in this fight. Thank you, he said softly. Both of you. I don't know what I'd do without you. As he headed for the door, Brian paused. One more thing, he said, turning back to Leroy and Maria. If Sophia comes down and asks where I am, you got called into work for an emergency, Leroy finished. Don't worry. We've got your back. Brian nodded, then slipped out into the gathering darkness. As he drove towards the hospital, his mind raced with possibilities. Sophia thought she had played him perfectly, but she had no idea what was coming. He would make sure justice was served, not just for himself, but for anyone else she and Marco had victimized. The night ahead would be long and challenging, filled with broken bodies and shattered lives from the highway pileup. But for Brian, it was just the beginning of a much bigger battle. A battle he intended to win, no matter the cost. Brian Hendricks sat in his office at the hospital, staring at the computer screen without really seeing it. A week had passed since he'd overheard Sophia's betrayal, and every day felt like walking through quicksand. But he couldn't let it show. Not yet. He glanced at his watch. 2 a.m. Sophia would be asleep by now, thinking he was pulling another late shift. Little did she know. Brian opened his email and crafted a message to the hospital staff about a surprise party for Sophia. He made sure to include details about her favorite foods, music, and friends. It was all bullshit, of course, but it had to look real. He left the email draft open on his laptop at home, making sure it was clearly visible on the kitchen counter. Sophia's curiosity would do the rest. The next morning, Brian pretended to rush out the door, forgetting to close his laptop. As he drove away, he watched Sophia in the rearview mirror, hovering near the kitchen window. The trap was set. Brian's next stop wasn't the hospital. He pulled into a nondescript office building on the outskirts of town. The sign on the door read, Hickman Investigations. Jeremy Hickman was waiting for him, a cup of coffee already poured. The PI had the look of a man who'd seen it all and wasn't impressed by any of it. Dr. Hendricks, Jeremy said, gesturing to a chair. What can I do for you? Brian sat down, his face a mask of determination. I need you to find everything you can on Sofia Aguilar and her boyfriend Marco. Leave no stone unturned. Jeremy raised an eyebrow. Everything? Everything, Brian confirmed. Bank records, phone logs, travel history. I want to know where they've been, who they've talked to, and what they've been planning. If they've done this before, I want proof. Jeremy nodded, making notes. It'll take time, and it won't be cheap. Brian's laugh was hollow. Money's not an issue. Just get me what I need. As he left Hickman's office, Brian's phone buzzed. A text from Sophia. Thinking of you, babe. Can't wait for you to come home. Brian's grip on the phone tightened. He typed back, miss you too. Busy day ahead. Don't wait up. Every lie felt like a victory. Sofia Aguilar stretched languidly on the couch, a glass of wine in her hand. She glanced at the clock. 11 p.m. Brian wouldn't be home for hours. Perfect. She pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. Hey, baby. Coast is clear. Come on over. 20 minutes later, Marco sauntered through the front door like he owned the place. In a way, Sophia mused, he soon would. Where's the good doctor? Marco asked, helping himself to Brian's expensive scotch. Sophia rolled her eyes. Where do you think? Saving lives or whatever. He won't be back until morning. Marco flopped down on the couch, pulling Sophia close. You know, I almost feel bad for the guy. Almost. They laughed, the sound echoing through the empty house. Neither of them noticed the tiny camera hidden in the bookshelf, its red light blinking steadily. Brian sat in his office at the hospital, his eyes glued to the live feed from his home security cameras. He watched as Sophia and Marco made themselves comfortable on the couch he'd bought for their second anniversary. Once I get my green card, we'll ditch this loser. Sophia's voice came through crystal clear. He's so naive, it's almost too easy. Marco's face filled the screen as he leaned in close to the camera. All of our victims are the same. So trusting, so stupid. We'll bleed him dry before we're done. Brian's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white. But he forced himself to remain calm. The evidence was piling up, and soon, he'd have everything he needed. A knock at the door startled him. Brian quickly minimized the video feed as a nurse poked her head in. Dr. Hendricks? We need you in trauma too. Multi-car pileup just came in. Brian nodded, his doctor's instincts kicking in. I'll be right there. As he scrubbed in for surgery, Brian compartmentalized his anger. He had lives to save. The reckoning would come soon enough. Jeremy Hickman dropped a thick file on Brian's desk. You're not gonna like what I found. Brian flipped open the folder, his eyes scanning the contents. Bank statements showing large transfers to offshore accounts. Travel records placing Sophia and Marco in 3 different states over the past 5 years. And most damning of all, marriage certificates. 3 of them. She's done this before, Brian said, his voice cold. Jeremy nodded. 3 times that I could confirm. Marries some poor sap, bleeds him dry, then disappears. You're lucky you caught on when you did. Brian leaned back in his chair, a grim smile on his face. Luck had nothing to do with it. But this changes everything. He picked up his phone and dialed. Maria? It's Brian. I need you to set up a meeting with William Sampson. Tell him it's urgent. William Sampson's office screamed old money and discreet power. The lawyer himself was a study in controlled aggression, his shark-like smile never quite reaching his eyes. Dr. Hendricks, William said, gesturing to a chair. Maria filled me in on the basics. I understand you have some new information? Brian laid out everything he'd gathered over the past week. The recorded conversations, the financial records, Jeremy's investigation results. When he finished, the room was silent. William whistled low. This is more than enough for a divorce. But with the immigration fraud angle, we can do much more. Maria, who'd been taking notes, looked up. I've already contacted IC. They're very interested in this case. Brian leaned back, a grim smile on his face. Good. Let's set the trap. William's eyes gleamed with the prospect of a challenging case. What did you have in mind, Doctor? A surprise party, Brian said, his voice dangerously calm. One Sophia and Marco will never forget. As they hashed out the details, Brian felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time since overhearing Sophia's betrayal, he felt in control. The game was rigged, but now he was the one holding all the cards. One more thing, Brian said as the meeting wound down. I want to make sure they can't do this to anyone else. Ever. William nodded, understanding the unspoken request. Leave it to me, Doctor. By the time we're done, they'll be lucky if they're allowed to stay in the country long enough for their trial. Brian stood, shaking hands with William and Maria. As he left the office, he pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to Sophia. Hey babe, clear your schedule for next Saturday. I've got a surprise for you. The response came almost immediately. Ooh, I love surprises. Can't wait. Brian's smile was cold. Neither can I, he muttered, pocketing the phone. The countdown to Sophia's downfall had begun. Sofia Aguilar stood in front of the full-length mirror, admiring her reflection. She'd spent hours getting ready, her dark hair cascading in loose waves, her makeup perfect. The red dress hugged her curves in all the right places. She looked good, and she knew it. You've outdone yourself this time, Sophia, she murmured, a smirk playing on her lips. Poor, stupid Brian. He actually thought he could surprise her. As if she hadn't seen right through his pathetic attempt at secrecy. She glanced at her phone. No messages from Marco. Good. He knew to keep his distance tonight. Can't risk ruining the charade now. Not when they were so close to the finish line. Sophia gave herself one last appraising look before heading downstairs. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Where was the music, the chatter of guests? Her brow furrowed slightly, but she shook off the unease. Brian was probably just running late. Classic Brian. Always putting work before everything else. She opened the front door, expecting to see a cab waiting to whisk her away to some fancy restaurant. Instead, she found herself face to face with a stern-looking man in a suit. Sofia Aguilar, he said, his voice clipped and professional. He held up a badge. I'm Agent Thompson with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. You're under investigation for immigration fraud. Sophia's blood ran cold. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when they were so close. She tried to slam the door shut, but a hand caught it. Brian stepped into view, his face a mask of cold fury. Surprise, darling, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. The party's over. Sophia's mind raced. How had he found out? She'd been so careful, so meticulous in covering her tracks. She forced a smile, her voice sickly sweet. Brian, honey, there must be some mistake. I don't understand what's happening. Brian's laugh was hollow. Oh, I think you understand perfectly, Sophia. Or should I say, Alicia? Or maybe Elena. How many names have you used? How many lives have you destroyed? Before Sophia could respond, William Sampson stepped forward, a thick envelope in his hand. These are divorce papers, along with a detailed account of your fraudulent activities. I suggest you read them carefully. Sophia's fingers trembled as she took the envelope. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. She'd wake up any moment now, curled up next to Marco, laughing about this ridiculous dream. But the cold metal of handcuffs around her wrists told her this was all too real. As the IC agents led her towards a waiting van, Sophia's shock gave way to anger. She'd come too far, sacrificed too much to let it end like this. She needed Marco. He'd know what to do. He always did. Marco Barnes was many things. Charming, ruthless, a born con man. But above all, he was a survivor. When Sophia's frantic text came through, 911. They know everything. Help. His first instinct was to run. But Marco didn't get where he was by abandoning ship at the first sign of trouble. No, Sophia was his meal ticket, his perfect partner in crime. If she went down, so did he. And Marco Barnes didn't go down without a fight. He gunned the engine of his sleek black Audi, weaving through traffic with reckless abandon. His mind raced, formulating plans and discarding them just as quickly. They'd need new identities, cash, a way out of the country. But first, he had to get Sophia away from whatever trap that idiot doctor had set. Marco screeched to a halt in front of Brian's house, not bothering to kill the engine as he leapt out. He barely registered the unmarked vans parked along the street, his focus entirely on getting to Sophia. He burst through the front door, ready for a fight. Instead, he found himself surrounded by grim-faced men in suits. ICE agents. Shit. You're just in time, Marco, a familiar voice called out. Brian stepped into view, his tone dangerously calm. I was hoping to meet the man who thought he could steal my life. Something in Marco snapped. All the careful planning, all the smooth talking that had gotten him out of countless tight spots before. It all went out the window. With a roar of rage, he lunged at Brian, intent on wiping that smug look off his face. But he never made it. Strong hands grabbed him from behind, restraining him. He thrashed wildly, spitting curses. You can't do this, Marco shouted, his carefully cultivated charm evaporating in the face of his fury. We'll fight you. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Brian stepped closer, his voice low and filled with a quiet menace that cut through Marco's bluster. Go ahead and try. I've got an army of lawyers and the full force of the law behind me. You two are finished. As the agents cuffed him and read him his rights, Marco's mind raced. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. He'd talked his way out of worse situations before. All he needed was time, a chance to spin this in his favor. But as he was led out to the waiting van, Marco caught sight of Sophia. The woman he'd thought of as his partner, his equal in every way, looked small and defeated. And for the first time in his life, Marco felt a flicker of doubt. The weeks that followed were a blur of interrogations, legal meetings, and sleepless nights for Sophia and Marco. They tried every trick in their considerable arsenal, playing the victims, claiming misunderstandings, spinning elaborate tales of conspiracy and frame-ups. But Brian had been thorough. Maddeningly, infuriatingly thorough. Every lie they told was met with a mountain of evidence to the contrary. Bank records, travel documents, testimony from their previous victims. It all painted a damning picture of a pair of heartless con artists who had left a trail of broken lives in their wake. Sophia watched as Marco's confident swagger gradually gave way to a desperate, cornered look. She'd always admired his ability to talk his way out of any situation, but now his silver tongue seemed to have turned to lead. For her part, Sophia tried to salvage what she could. She considered turning on Marco, painting herself as an unwilling accomplice. But the evidence against her was too strong, her own recorded words too damning. As their web of lies unraveled, Sophia found herself thinking more and more about Brian. How had she underestimated him so badly? The man she dismissed as a naive workaholic had outplayed them at every turn. It was almost admirable, in a way that made her blood boil. While Sophia and Marco's world crumbled around them, Brian threw himself into his work with renewed vigor. The aftermath of the highway pileup had left the hospital understaffed and overwhelmed. Brian worked tirelessly, coordinating care, performing surgeries, and mentoring younger doctors. His colleagues marveled at his focus, his dedication. They'd all heard whispers of his personal troubles. It was impossible to keep secrets in a hospital, but Brian never let it affect his work. I don't know how you do it, man, Dr. Chen said one night as they scrubbed out after a particularly grueling surgery. If my wife pulled that kind of crap on me, I'd be a mess. Brian's smile was tight but genuine. The way I see it, I've got two choices. I can let what Sophia did destroy me, or I can use it as fuel to be better. To do better, he shrugged. Besides, these patients need me. Their lives don't stop just because mine hit a speed bump. Word of Brian's resilience spread through the hospital. Nurses who had once found him aloof now saw a man of quiet strength. Fellow surgeons who had dismissed him as a workaholic gained a new respect for his dedication. And through it all, Brian kept pushing forward. Every life he saved, every family he gave good news to, it all helped to wash away the bitter taste Sophia had left in his mouth. The day of the final hearing arrived with a weight of inevitability. Brian sat in the courtroom, Leroy on one side, Maria on the other. He could feel Sophia and Marco's eyes boring into him from across the room, but he didn't give them the satisfaction of looking their way. The judge, a stern-faced woman with steely gray hair, took her seat. The courtroom fell silent. Having reviewed all the evidence presented in this case, the judge began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. This court finds the evidence of immigration fraud to be both substantial and incontrovertible. Brian felt Leroy's hand on his shoulder, a silent show of support. Therefore, in the matter of Hendricks versus Aguilar, this court rules in favor of the plaintiff, Dr. Brian Hendricks. The marriage between Brian Hendricks and Sofia Aguilar is hereby annulled. A soft murmur ran through the courtroom. Brian allowed himself a small, grim smile. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, in light of the criminal nature of the defendant's actions, Sofia Aguilar and Marco Barnes are to be remanded to ICE custody pending deportation proceedings. The judge's gavel came down with a decisive crack. It was over. Brian watched as Sofia and Marco were led away in handcuffs, their faces a mix of shock and defeat. He felt, not happiness, exactly, but a sense of justice served, of a chapter finally closed. He turned to his friends, a genuine smile on his face for the first time in months. "It's over," he said, relief evident in his voice. "They can't hurt anyone else now." Leroy clapped him on the back, his grin wide. "You did it, man. You stood strong and came out on top." As they left the courthouse, Brian paused on the steps, taking a deep breath of fresh air. The sky seemed bluer, the air cleaner than it had in months. He wasn't just free of Sofia's deception. He'd emerged stronger, wiser, ready to face whatever challenges life threw his way next. "So, what now?" Maria asked as they walked towards the parking lot. Brian's smile was determined. Now I get back to work. I've got lives to save." And as he drove back to the hospital, Brian felt a sense of peace settle over him. Sofia and Marco had tried to destroy his life, but they'd failed. He was Dr. Brian Hendricks, trauma surgeon, and he was just getting started. Epilogue. 6 months had passed since the gavel fell, sealing Sofia and Marco's fate. The aftermath of the trial had rippled through the lives of all involved, reshaping futures and redefining paths. Brian Hendricks stood at the nurse's station, reviewing a patient's chart. The hospital buzzed with its usual controlled chaos, a rhythm he'd grown to love even more in recent months. He'd thrown himself into his work with renewed passion, earning a reputation as one of the most dedicated and skilled trauma surgeons in the state. His phone buzzed. A text from Leroy. "Just heard from William. S&M's appeal denied. Deportation proceedings starting next week." Brian allowed himself a small, grim smile. Sofia and Marco's desperate attempts to avoid justice had finally run out of steam. Their deportation was now inevitable. He typed back a quick, "Thanks for letting me know," before returning to his charts. Sofia Aguilar and Marco Barnes had been fighting tooth and nail since their conviction. They'd hired a series of increasingly desperate lawyers, each promising to overturn the verdict. But the evidence Brian had gathered was ironclad. With each failed appeal, the reality of their situation sank in deeper. Last Brian heard, Sofia was facing deportation back to her home country, where she was wanted for questioning in connection with several other fraud cases. The charming smile that had once wrapped men around her finger now seemed permanently replaced by a bitter scowl. Marco hadn't fared any better. His attempts to charm the guards and manipulate the system had backfired spectacularly. He'd been caught trying to bribe an IC officer, adding another charge to his already lengthy list of offenses. He was looking at significant jail time before his eventual deportation. Leroy Woodward had become something of a local hero. His role in exposing the fraud had caught the attention of the hospital board. He'd recently been promoted to chief of surgery, a position he was thriving in. He and Brian had grown even closer through the ordeal, their friendship strengthened by shared adversity. Maria Rodriguez, the paralegal who had been instrumental in building the case against Sofia and Marco, had found her calling. Inspired by the impact she'd had on Brian's case, she decided to go to law school. She was now in her first year, already making waves with her keen understanding of immigration law. William Sampson, the shark-like lawyer who had eviscerated Sofia and Marco's defense, had seen his reputation soar. He was now the go-to attorney for high-profile fraud cases, his name spoken with a mixture of respect and fear in legal circles. Jeremy Hickman, the private investigator, had leveraged his role in uncovering Sophia and Marco's scheme into a booming business. He was now specializing in exposing immigration fraud, his services in high demand among both private citizens and law enforcement agencies. As for Brian himself, the experience had changed him profoundly. The naive trust that had made him an easy target was gone, replaced by a keen understanding of human nature in all its complexity. But rather than making him bitter, it had given him a new appreciation for genuine connections. He'd started volunteering at a support group for victims of fraud, sharing his story and helping others rebuild their lives. It was there that he'd met Claire, a fellow survivor with a quick wit and a warm smile. They'd started dating recently, taking things slow, both appreciative of the genuine bond forming between them. Dr. Hendricks? A timid voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Sarah, one of the new interns, clutching a medical journal. I was wondering if you had a moment to discuss this article on innovative trauma procedures. Brian smiled, genuinely pleased by the young doctor's initiative. Of course, Sarah. Let's grab a coffee and go over it. As they walked to the cafeteria, Brian caught his reflection in a window. The man looking back at him seemed older, more seasoned, but there was a strength in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Sophia's deceit had nearly broken him, but instead, it had forged him into something stronger. Later that evening, as Brian scrubbed in for a particularly challenging surgery, he caught the eye of Dr. Chen across the operating room. "You good, Hendricks?" Chen asked, his eyes crinkling with a mixture of concern and respect above his surgical mask. Brian nodded, feeling the familiar calm settle over him as he prepared to do what he did best. "Never better," he replied, and meant it. As the first incision was made, Brian focused entirely on the task at hand. Sophia, Marco, the trial, all of it faded away. In this moment, there was only the patient, the challenge, and Brian's unwavering commitment to saving lives. He was Dr. Brian Hendricks, trauma surgeon. He'd faced betrayal, fought back, and won. And now, he was ready for whatever came next. The heart monitor beeped steadily, a rhythmic reminder of the life in his hands. Brian smiled behind his mask. This was where he belonged. This was who he was meant to be. "Scalpel," he said, his voice strong and sure. The real work, the work that truly mattered, was just beginning.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.